This week's lecture is going to be enterprise blockchain, real-world applications. In other words, where can blockchain be used in the real world, and more importantly, what restrictions are placed upon blockchain that that change how it can be used in the real world. Because its goal is to deregulate in a world full of regulations. How exactly does that pan out? So I'm Pikachu. I'll be your lecturer for today. Who's that lecturer? Yeah. So. Feel free to ask any questions during this lecture. It's meant to be more open discussion. I'll be throwing out a bunch of information. It may start to feel a little redundant because a lot of these use cases ended up overlapping a lot. So feel free to ask as many questions as you want. Right. So a quick overview. I'll start off by talking about the platforms and the tools that are used for developing, the use cases and the industries in which previous proofs of concepts or research is being done, some big names in the space, and then go on to ICOs, and finally talk about laws and regulations that apply to cryptocurrencies and to blockchains. So first and foremost, some platforms and tools. Hyperledger is one popular foundation that you've probably heard of in the blockchain space. It aims to provide blockchain software for any private or consortium blockchain. It aims to make blockchains that are suited for particular industries, such as for finance, such as for healthcare or supply chain. It's led by the Linux Foundation and IBM, and it has a whole bunch of members that are all dedicated to making this environment that's open source, collaborative, and can allow any industry to jump in and use this software in order to develop their own blockchain application. That way you don't need to go out and make your own from scratch. You can take some of what they've made as a base and use that, modify it a little bit, so that you don't have to go through all the legwork yourself. They use Hyperledger Fabric, the fabric that brings everything together, to make this network that allows you to connect and use modular pieces to figure out what works best for whatever your particular use case is. It's still in the beta phase, like most things in the blockchain space, so it's not actually being fully used yet. But the idea is for there to be a standard for enterprise software, for enterprise blockchain software, and for tools that are used by the enterprise. You have Consensus, which is another popular company. You've probably heard of this if you've been doing any research on the side. Consensus is an incubator for Ethereum-focused applications, startups, and developer tools. You'll notice that Consensus is this umbrella company that has all these different smaller initiatives. It has Gnosis, which is one of those decentralized prediction markets we talked about. It has MetaMask, which is a Chrome extension that allows you to interact with Ethereum using through a web app. It has Truffle, which allows you to more easily migrate, compile, and work with smart contracts. And it has several other smaller names that fit under this giant umbrella. It was founded in 2015 by Joe Lubin, a co-founder of Ethereum. And it's, as I mentioned, this idea of a central company with all these different spoke ventures that all have their own specific initiative, that they're trying, their own specific mission. And this is also just to provide more infrastructure for Ethereum. It allows for developers to not have to deal with the struggle of making things like this themselves or dealing with the hassle of getting around it through some hacky way. Instead, they have some standard method by which they can create and use smart contracts and connect to them. Consensus does a lot of outreach, actually, in order to help the space to develop. For example, they have the Ethereal conference, which was last weekend, and a hackathon that was hosted here, actually at UC Berkeley in Haas by Blockchain Berkeley, a hackathon 2 weeks ago. So their goal is to reach out to the community and spur up as many of these new independent ventures as they can. Then you have R3. R3 is an initiative to connect a bunch of banks together. They noticed that banks, there's a lot of issues, especially with international banking, and the amount of time it takes for one bank to confirm that some payment is valid or that some payment should go through. If you've ever dealt with international banks, you'll notice it takes days for payments to go through, and even nationally, there's a lot of inefficiencies in the banking system because of lacks of trust. So the idea is through using a blockchain, you're now able to connect a bunch of banks onto this central platform. So R3 was focused on developing Corda, which is a private, open source, distributed ledger platform designed for banks. And the idea was just to make things much easier for banks in their communication and to take away a lot of the intermediary struggles that banks face in validating past histories and confirming newer ones faster. Are there any questions about some of those key players? All right, sweet. Now let's talk about use cases and industries. These aren't necessarily ones that are going to necessarily work, but they're ones that we've been seeing popping up and are interesting to think about whether or not they're going to work. So first, looking at auto and mobility. If you've heard of Daimler, that's the company, that's the umbrella company for Mercedes-Benz, and it joined IBM and Linux for the Hyperledger project in February 2017. They were aiming to develop multiple blockchain and IoT use cases. They've been looking into funding for blockchain research. They actually released a bond, performed an entire bond transaction from start to finish over a private blockchain network that they developed. They acquired some European payment startup called Paycash, which supports Bitcoin payments, so as to experiment with sending perhaps car-to-car payments. That way you no longer need to do it manually. For example, you're now able to, for whatever reason, if you need some transaction between machines, you now have the ability to natively transact cryptocurrencies between these machines, which we'll see what you can do with those in a little bit. And there's also interests sort of a little off of the machine aspect, which is about data integrity and data sharing with other auto companies. Because we know that data sharing, the more information you have, the better research you can do, so you can create some sort of data marketplace perhaps. So we see that data sharing and exchange are very interesting things if you can use a blockchain to make these this marketplace, or to make it easier to share information. So what you can do is pay vehicle owners by using some token. We're all driving, or for those of us who drive, we are going to be driving anyway, and we're going to be producing this information. We might as well get compensated for the work that we're going to be doing anyway. So through having a token that's paid out to us every time we give information to this to some entity that wants it, then we can share the information, get in response some token, which we can use for whatever payments we want to use them for. So this incentivizes drivers naturally to share their information, and it also allows drivers to keep their information private if they don't necessarily want to share it. And this allows for the development of what could look like either a decentralized database, where you can see a whole slew of information, or even a decentralized marketplace, where people can sell their information at certain rates depending on what the supply and demand looks like. And that's what these two different initiatives are trying to do. And some other use cases that are natural, keeping track of automobile parts. You have the natural supply chain use case. In order to track where parts have come from, and more importantly, to track where parts have come from in the event of failure, you can look up like a certain part's ID and see the whole history of where it was from start to finish. So that way, if you see that some particular batch of parts is failing, you can now more reliably get to the source of which places were manufacturing these parts, and then from there, more reliably fix the source of the problem. You also have the idea of machine-to-machine payments. So it's interesting to imagine if you have two cars or a few cars that are trying to bet for some open spot in the lane, and they could be sending money to each other or betting with each other about who's going to be able to get into the spot. And every person wants to say that I will put up 0.05 ether if you let me slip into the spot. So they can, the other cars can act as oracles once these cars have rearranged, however it may be. If one car slowed down and gave access to another car, that other car is able to fit into this other lane. All of these cars report on what happened. They report that this car slowed down to allow for this other car to move in, and because of that, this transaction of this amount needs to go through because this car said they were willing to do that based on these circumstances. So if you can objectively identify that something has or has not happened, it's a really good use case for a smart contract, because you're just automating some process. Rather, you take out the human execution error. So by doing that, it's pretty straightforward. You can just have the machines bet amongst each other and then resolve by submitting information about what happened to the network. And you can even pay external accounts, such as tolls, or for vehicle charging stations. And there are examples in Germany, and we have some other ones in California. And this is the idea of car sharing. This one's tricky because, like anything in the sharing economy, there's a lot of human judgment that's required. Like, would you feel comfortable renting out your car to a stranger? Even if you knew that you could trace it or that you knew who had taken it, what do you do if someone had put too much mileage on it? What do you do if someone accidentally hit another car? You have to make sure that you have some central entity that's enforcing whatever laws and regulations you want implemented in this decentralized system. This is why it's hard to completely decentralize Uber or to completely decentralize Airbnb. How do you, in a decentralized manner, ascertain whether or not some Airbnb is healthy enough or clean enough to be used by other people? This all comes down to human judgment, because you need someone who's some human, unless you have some very good artificial intelligence to make those judgments. Any questions so far? Big banks and financial institutions, naturally these guys are going to want, you have a bunch of banks that are trying to do transactions with each other. They don't necessarily trust each other. What does it sound like? It sounds like some blockchain use case. That's what Ripple tried to do by creating this consortium blockchain in which anyone can own Ripple, but the people who can validate transactions are the banks. So if you recall from the last lecture, Rusty talked about federated consensus, and this is what Ripple uses. So Ripple only has a 20% Byzantine fault tolerance, but it makes up for this with assumptions of trust that only banks are going to be in the system, they'll be less incentivized to act maliciously, and there's also this mechanism in which you can reverse transactions in Ripple, which is interesting because this is something you can't explicitly do in Bitcoin. You can fork a block and render that block invalid, but you can't explicitly reverse a transaction without being the person to, like, on the other end, sending the transaction. Like if someone notices that your transaction is invalid and the rest of the network wants to say that this is invalid and should not have happened, they can revert it, even if you didn't want it to be reverted. So it gives up consistency for availability. It makes it easier for people, or easier for banks in this case, to make transactions and clean up the mess later. And then you have SWIFT, which is like a bank messaging system that's used in international payments. And the idea is kind of like to compete with Ripple's product. It's to come up with some idea of a blockchain-based transaction system by which you can do the same thing. You can accomplish this global infrastructure between banks. Well, now you don't need some intermediary taking days to confirm transactions. Instead, you reference this currency, the history of this currency, and now you have a ledger by which you can act. You submit a transaction, and in minutes, if not seconds, you have a confirmation, which is considered legitimate by all of the other banks. Yeah, go ahead.
So in the current SWIFT system, for example, each bank has a SWIFT code, right?
Yeah.
Like, and if you're sending money from, like, for example, say India to US, there's like an incoming wire charge of the $15 or $20, right? Mm-hmm. Which if you increase the money amount sent is not much. So like how is Ripple essentially competing against SWIFT, and what kind of fees are we looking at when it comes to wire transfers?
Right. The fees I'm not sure about. Yeah, I'm not sure about the fees. That I can't say, unfortunately. But the idea is that you no longer have to pay these exorbitant fees because you're not dealing with individual transactions overseas or even nationally, because you just need to trust that the banks are going to do whatever they do in their own currency, and that change is going to be represented as like the change in perhaps your bank account. Like if there's money being sent from one bank to another that happens to be in your account, they can send it through Ripple, and that change represents like the change in the accounts.
Essentially, how does Ripple make money?
So Ripple can make money based on the appreciation of their currency. Okay. So if this organization owns a lot of the currency and puts time into making it a solid currency and people use it, then they're going to make money off of that. So it's like an indirect profit. Yeah. I'm not sure if they have a particular fee system. Any other questions? Sweet. We have JP Morgan, which is an interesting one. You guys have probably heard of Jamie Dimon. He's the guy who, in the second lecture, said Bitcoin is trash, Bitcoin's going to fail. He's been saying it recently too, but he also says that blockchain is something to look at, blockchain is something to invest in, and continuously, JP Morgan has been participating in big blockchain initiatives. such as the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, R3, and Hyperledger. And they're also developing Quorum, which Rusty mentioned before. It's a raft-based consensus blockchain that is focused on banks and trusting banks to participate in the network instead of having Byzantine fault tolerance. So that's the hybrid public-private, in that you have a consortium of banks which can all, you have certain people who can vote, but everything's open source. So one note is that they want to augment the privacy, because if you're a bank, you don't want people seeing how much money you have, how much money your clients have, how much money you're transacting on a daily basis. You'd rather not share that information. But if you want the benefits of a blockchain and its transparency and in its ability to get validation from external third parties rather than having to have someone trust your word or having an auditor, then you want to combine the two, the privacy and the blockchain. So this is what zero-knowledge proofs are for. If you've heard of Zcash, as we mentioned back in the second lecture, zero-knowledge proofs are a way for you to say that some statement is true without knowing the information behind it. So you're able to hide the information about the transaction and still validate that the transaction is valid. So you can say that no bank is spending more than it has in its account, while still validating that. You can validate all of this without knowing how much that the bank has in its account. So it's very helpful for banks, because now they no longer have to expose their information with other banks to still gain the benefits of this transparency and external validation. Goldman Sachs. I bring Goldman Sachs up not because they've necessarily done anything significant, but because it's interesting to see that where they stand. So they've been exploring more cautiously, being a more conservative company. They haven't done anything like JP Morgan has, but they are naturally, to avoid falling behind, putting in research and trying to see where they can use cryptocurrencies or use blockchain to work with their own needs, such as wealth management and brokerage desks. So you have an internal group that's working on information, but they're waiting to see how blockchain actually affects its financial services. So they're much more cautious, but after other people have done the trailblazing, they may jump in, like what happens with most other tech opportunities. You have American Express. This idea, I'm not sure that I completely would be behind, because I'm not sure, it doesn't seem feasible or even meaningful to do with a blockchain. It's taking customer reward programs and using a blockchain for data record keeping and using cryptocurrency for reward points. It seems like a lot of effort to go through in order to say that someone has a number of reward points in their name, but that's what American Express at least is considering doing. And allegedly it's so that you can better store this information, better store this data, and that's their argument. But you can see why it doesn't work, or it may not work, because you could very easily do this with a central solution. You wouldn't think of using a blockchain here unless you were just really on the blockchain hype train. If you hadn't heard of a blockchain, you'd be able to... People have customer rewards programs nowadays. No one really complains about them. No one says, oh, my number should have been 603, it was actually 602. I'm very upset. I need more transparency in my rewards points so I can buy more coffee bags. Whatever it is that this person's interested in, no one's really that concerned with the transparency of the rewards points. So it seems like a lot of overhead for just a rewards points program. And finally, some other companies and industries. You have Walmart and Alibaba. Naturally, when you have these big companies that are moving a lot of goods, they want to be able to keep track of the goods that they're moving, and more importantly, if there's an issue with one of their goods, they want to be able to trace back where this issue originated. So this is why blockchain for supply chain makes sense here. Walmart's doing a trial with Hyperledger to track the movements and origins of pork, so that if there are food safety problems, they can track the origin of where this meat came from and either stop doing business with that vendor, alert other people to stop doing business with that vendor, or figure out if there was some mistake that was a one-time thing. And Alibaba is seeking to do something similar, but to reduce counterfeiting. They want to know where the product comes from, which retailer it's coming from, and the source, so that they now have all the information they need to validate whether or not something is truly legitimate as they claim it is. So they spent about 2 years developing their own in-house private blockchain network in order to track some of their some of the goods that they are afraid may be at risk of counterfeiting. And you have some other corporations. You have Maersk, which is a shipping company, so naturally you can use Hyperledger potentially to track the movement of shipping cargo for shipping cargo and freight tracking. And you have Cisco, which is interested in blockchain plus IoT. The reason why blockchain plus IoT is interesting because now you no longer need a central server to talk to act as an intermediary for all these IoT devices. Now these devices can talk between each other and exchange information between each other and maintain a log that still eventually resolves itself without the need for some other level of intrusion. If you've heard of IPFS before, the Interplanetary File Storage System, what this allows you to do is to communicate with your peers. Let's say that Google server shut down, but you were working on some important, like the final essay for this class, and you were working on it with like this entire class. So if Google's server shut down, typically you'd have no way to work on it with your peers. But with IPFS, you can share between your peers like updates to these files, and this is a similar concept that you can share between devices updates without going through a central server. Though you are still able to communicate with a central server to keep track of updates and to maintain consistency. But this at least adds resiliency so that you don't need a central server at all times. Any questions so far? Yeah, go ahead.
Not to sound too suspicious, but the previous technology that you just outlined, wouldn't that be the perfect structure for creating and maintaining pirated content?
Creating and maintaining pirated content?
Decentralized distribution, peer-to-peer, like it's like a perfect peer-to-peer sharing network, and you could have like paid pirated content?
Yeah, that's kind of how pirated content works nowadays. When you Tor to serve, you act as a seed from which others can extract information. So yes, you could say this could facilitate that. Yeah, that's a very valid point. And it's questions like that which yield what types of regulations can we impose on it. Any other questions? Sweet. So yeah, going into some big names in the blockchain space. The Enterprise Ethereum Alliance is a consortium of 150 plus Fortune 500 companies, startups, academic institutions, and governments, which are all interested in seeing the development of Ethereum, particularly for the use of companies, for developers, for businesses in general. So they're focused more on how can we make it such that Ethereum can, as a public network, can thrive with the development of these businesses and vice versa. So that if there's some improvement in the public version of Ethereum, it can move to all of these private versions. And if some private version has some upgrade that is very meaningful, then they can share that with the rest of their peers as well. So the idea is just to create this community of people who are like-minded, going for the same goal, just to have them communicating and like tracking their progress, going along this similar mentality so that they can align their goals and make sure that they're doing things effectively. You have the United Nations, which is looking into two particular projects. In May, actually, they recorded and provided food vouchers to 10,000 Syrian refugees, according to CoinDesk, in Jordan. So these were some cryptocurrency-based vouchers that allowed them to redeem food at participating markets, which meant that you no longer had to pay and you no longer had to give a stipend in euros or in some other currency. You can now assign some token via the Ethereum blockchain, which will now allow you to redeem that at some market. So you've created sort of like a food stamp, but in a virtual world, so that you don't need to have a physical one on you. You just need to have some identification, whether it be a private key or whatever other mean they use to maintain identity. And UNICEF's doing something very interesting. They're exploring issuing some custom currency via an ICO. Oh, that's a bad sign. To support programs, they accept Ether donations to their Ethereum account, and they have a venture fund that's targeting $10 million across 10 different blockchain and cryptocurrency startups. They're focused on remittances and digital identity of all things. You know, it's sort of odd to think of UNICEF as the one doing these particular things, launching an ICO and focusing on these specific issues, remittances and digital identity. You have the International Monetary Fund, which naturally wants to make international money more efficient and international blockchain usually comes to mind. The idea is that, again, exploring, making cross-border payments more effective, but this one part threw me off a little bit. They were looking into central bank digital currencies. That doesn't seem like it really needs a blockchain. In the end, it's just a number. Like, the only advantage that blockchain gives is that you no longer need a central entity validating, or you don't need a central entity storing all the information. But for a central bank, do you really want anything otherwise? Do you want other banks validating on your behalf? In that case, it's not really a central bank digital currency. So, yeah, interesting problem they're trying to solve, but not sure about their approach to it. Christine Lagarde said that they think they're about to see massive disruptions, right? Lots of buzzwords, throwing buzzwords, buzzword salad. That it might be more useful for countries with weak infrastructures and unstable national currencies. The interesting thing is that it's hard to develop infrastructure for a specific country. What type of person is incentivized, unless they're being paid a handsome salary, to develop some infrastructure for a country or for any particular region? It's much easier for countries or for people in countries to bootstrap themselves onto existing infrastructure, such as the Ethereum public blockchain, than it is to create their own infrastructure, hope that it's secure against attacks, and have someone develop it for them in-house just for their particular needs. So it's I would think it's much easier to bootstrap off existing and tested infrastructure than to try to generate your own custom infrastructure. I think it would be common sense to just go based off of what already exists. And then you have the World Bank, which is launched the Blockchain Lab in 2017, exploring 70 plus use cases allegedly, looking to improve governance, social outcomes, all those general things to fight corruption, take the power out of central entities and make transparency a priority, make power to the people a priority. You have the Gates Foundation, which has actually been supporting, studying blockchain for using that to support the underbanked since 2015. It's actually places which don't have the infrastructure to receive, for example, loans, that don't have the infrastructure to develop the way that we have the luxury to. So they developed through the Mojo Loop project that was announced this month, that they would support mobile payment transfers for underbanked populations and provide an interoperability layer using Ripple's interledger protocol. So the idea is building off of this protocol for just making it easier to transact. Now you can do Ripple payments, but through mobile devices in places that aren't necessarily that don't have access to banks, but may have access to smartphones or other technology. Other institutions, particularly government institutions, are the U.S. State Department, the European Union, and U.S. Department of Homeland Security. They're all trying to do mostly the same things that we've been talking about. They've been trying to improve currently stagnating processes, investigating use of blockchains to advance diplomacy, and so on. Their goal is just to see how well can blockchain solve some problems. And the goal of all of these slides is just to show you how much breadth there is to all of the attempts that people are trying to do. It goes from all the way to the UN, to the government, to individual banks and businesses. And then you have some other major consortia that are looking to do their own particular thing, whether it be IoT, decentralized identity, or just looking into specific banks or specific sectors. Are there any questions so far? Sweet. Now we're going to get into one of the more interesting parts of the lecture, which is like ICO schemas and ICO culture. I know we've talked about ICOs before, but this is more to break down what ICOs are in terms of their impact on the ecosystem. Right? We know of them as this novel, unregulated means of raising funds for some blockchain startup, because again, you launch a token on the Ethereum blockchain. No one can tell you that you can't do this, because the whole point of the Ethereum blockchain is to be unregulated. You should be able to do what you want without being stopped by any central entity, without being censored by any particular agenda, or by any particular organization with their own agenda. So the reason that ICOs are so, that's why ICOs are so easily accessible. You just take a contract, add a little spice to it, and now you have your own, whatever token may be, your own BAB token. Right, now you're able to make money off of it by claiming that you have an idea, or you're going to make a project, and now you need funding for this project. Right, so what an ICO is supposed to be is it's supposed to be this innovation where it's perfectly suited for technologies that only early adopters understand, such as infrastructure. It's suited for technologies where there's an immediately high capital requirement, and it answers the question of how you fund infrastructure without government. If the government's not able to pay for the infrastructure, you look to the people who would benefit from the infrastructure. And these people can pay into this crowd fund, receive a token, which gives them some privilege, for example, to use a product, or whatever else the token may be used for, and then those people can benefit because they're putting their money into something that they know well, and the developers benefit because now they found a way to overcome the immediately high capital requirement by getting a lot of money before the product has actually been shipped, or has actually been put into development. So this ideally aligns the incentives between the development team and the early investors, where the early investors trust that whatever this product is going to work well, and the development team now has a group of people who are able to fund them when they can't get funding from the government, if they need to raise a large amount of money. Crowd sales will typically tell you how to buy these tokens, where you can buy them, the way that the tokens will be distributed, but most of these crowd sales are no longer focused on aligning these incentives. Actually, it's quite the opposite in today's world. Like, we see that ICOs are more popular than the VCs for funding blockchain startups because they're so easy to do, and because you don't really have the regulation overhead. For example, there was some paper that compared smart contracts to mission-critical national projects, but showed the discrepancy between how much we think about the security in the launch of a space shuttle versus how much we think about the security in the launch of an ICO. There are people who will say, oh yeah, I'm making Jeff coin, this is completely for laughs, you shouldn't buy this thing. They make $70,000 in one day because people are just, they see ICO and they put money into it. There was some company that put the name blockchain at the end of their company name, and their stocks went up 394% in, I think, about a day. Because people just see this stuff and they don't think much, they just start putting money into it, which is completely the opposite of what an ICO is supposed to do. An ICO is supposed to be for those people who really know this stuff, not for people who really don't know this stuff. Like, we see that ICOs are mostly for infrastructure, naturally for data storage as well, but it goes through as much as through mining, social network, commodities, art and music, all the way to drugs and healthcare. Like, there's a huge breadth of stuff that can be funded with an ICO, and that is being funded with an ICO. But the issue is that people aren't doing their own due diligence on ICOs, they aren't regulating, they aren't taking the time to think about what they're putting their money into. They're simply putting the money into it and hoping that because it's called an ICO or because it's called a blockchain startup, that's going to make them money. There's some legal uncertainty around what an ICO... Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Well, sorry, I was curious. I mean, I think it's easy to say that, yeah, they're dumb, but what about the effect, the feedback loop of people who want to prey on the other people that they view are dumb? You know, like the fact that, I mean, that like repercussive effect of a bubble. Do you think it really is people who are just jumping on the gun, or people who are trying to hop in on the trend and make their profit and get out?
I think it's both. I think it's the early investors who are abusing the later investors, because the early investors know that the late investors are going to try to get in while they can, but the early ones are moving so fast that by the time the late investors get in, they're going to have lost all their money. So I do think that it's a tricky scene where you have the people who make these ICOs that, like, a lot of ICOs are not attempting to do something bad or to scam people. I think about 75% of ICOs, I mean, that's just out of nowhere. Like my own estimation, those are people trying to make an ICO, they don't know what they're doing. There's 20% that are intentionally scamming people, and there's 5% that are doing something legitimate. So of the 20%, like, there are also people in the ecosystem that aren't necessarily making the ICOs, but they're making money off of the ICOs, making money off of the trend of people trying to buy in a little too late, and then only buying in at the peak and then watching all their money go away. So yeah, it's a nasty feedback loop because they see it's sustainable if they know what they're doing. Go ahead.
Is there any way to regulate ICOs?
Right. So the question was whether you can regulate ICOs. Naturally, the only way you can regulate ICOs is by the central government has to have some legitimacy by which they can, or some claim to regulation. The same way that you were able to regulate, if you recall, there was this one case, I forget which motel, it was back in the 19-somethings, there was a this case of racial discrimination where this person was denied access to a motel and they said that they shouldn't be allowed to do that, and the federal government said that they were allowed to regulate it because of the fact that people come from all over the country to live at this motel, and therefore it's cross-state commerce, and therefore the federal government can regulate it. So this example is just to show that if the federal government can say that there is some means by which these ICOs fall under their jurisdiction, then they have the complete ability to regulate it as if it were like abstracted just some security, for example, or some commodity. The problem is that they can't regulate the actual transactions. They can only regulate the endpoints of these transactions. They can regulate the movement of fiat into crypto or vice versa. So that's what they can do the most regulation. They can stop ICOs from having access to US citizens. They can force them to block the IP addresses of US citizens. They can sue anyone who is attempting to interact with US citizens if they say that they should not be allowed to based on whatever circumstances. Yeah, we'll get into that a little more later. Any other questions? All right, sweet. All right, so there's some legal uncertainty, which comes back to whether or not it can be regulated, about what ICOs actually are. Are they securities? In other words, are they supposed to make people money? Or are they access tokens? Are they products that give the user some right, that give the user some privilege? It's tricky, because there are certain people who, no matter what they're being told, for example, the Cosmos ICO, they insisted that, they said, this is not going to make you money. If you buy into our ICO, you're probably going to lose money. They said that repeatedly, but in the site they had people saying, oh yeah, it's going to go up 10% in the next 5 days. There was no way for people to get rid of this expectation that people were going to make money. A security is determined as security by the Howey test, which is made by 3 components. You have the investment of money into a common enterprise with the expectation of profits based on the work of others. So, if you remember the DAO, which was this venture capital firm into which everyone bought, hoping to make money, you invested money into this common enterprise, which is the venture capital fund, with the expectation of profit from the work of others, which was the investment, the choices by others, into certain startups that would then bring back money. Right, so that's why the DAO was considered a security by the SEC, and by extension, anything else that behaves like the DAO tokens would be considered a security and would be able to be regulated as such. Which is why a lot of ICO tokens a lot of ICOs have started blocking US IP addresses because they don't want to get in trouble with the SEC for even being close to infringing on what is and what is not legal. So, no matter how much someone tries to say you should not expect to make money, you should not treat this like a security, it's still very possible that by the perception of people, by this constant idea that ICOs and token sales are going to lead to money and profit, it's hard to get any legitimacy and distinguish what your token actually is. But ideally what ICOs would be are access tokens, which allow for easy early access to products and services. They serve as they give the users a right. For example, let's say that you know that Tesla is going to release a car in 3 years. You don't have, you can't buy it now. What you can do is buy into their ICO. And their ICO says that if you have 400 of this token, then you can use that to redeem one Tesla Model Z, for example. So you can buy it for about 10,000 now and redeem a car that's worth 60,000 in the future, because it's just it's like a pre-sale. You buy in earlier, you get more than what you paid into at the risk of that product not actually being what you thought it would be or not even being developed at all. Right, so that's the idea of the access token, but it shouldn't be the expectation that you're going to trade these tokens and that you're going to get money out of these tokens. It should be that you have some privilege now, that you've bought into this token, that you've helped this company fundraise for the next project. That's what the ICO should be, but the security aspect is what it has turned into. Then it's a question of how do we then align incentives? How do we make sure that people only do ICOs in a way that is beneficial both for the community and for themselves? Well, it's usually open source, led by organizations such as the Mozilla Foundation, the Apache Foundation, and dependent on donations and volunteers. But the issue is that the creators, they only get a small amount of the value that they've created. So they're incentivized to make the software proprietary, to keep it to themselves, which causes paywalls, which restricts access, and this isn't in the best interest of users. So the ICO's innovation is that you can now monetize this, this open source idea and make money off of it, even though you're not necessarily getting directly paid for it. The software is still open source, but now they have this access, or whatever it may be. You're associating yourself with this idea. Now you can make money off of the fact that you're doing good. That leads to some issues in which, like, you have a misalignment of incentives. When you get $200 million from an ICO, what's to make sure that you do the product? So let's say that in this world, you have some ICO that raised $200 million, and in 5 years, Ethereum is going to go up 10% in value, right? Which is a small amount compared to what we see today. Just that small amount. And let's say that in the contract it says, if the product is not delivered within 5 years, we will refund the same value in US dollars to every single participant. They get 200 million in Ether, that appreciates 10%, and then at the end of the 5 years, they give back $200 million. By sitting on their butts for 5 years, they now have $10 million in their pockets. Like, that's a misalignment of incentives. They got paid to do nothing, to just put out a white paper, if even that, and never develop a product. So now you have this misalignment of incentives where people are paying into something that may never happen and giving up their money, giving up their power. Right, there's no VC or investors to demand their money back the same way that you have with traditional funding. So the early adopters are usually going to benefit, but the later adopters will usually lose because people who buy in very early tend to make 4 or 5 times what they paid in and then sell the tokens right away because they don't actually care about the tokens, they just want the profit. And they're just leeching off of the system in this ugly feedback loop. One way that you can align these incentives is by now putting checkpoints such that you have people report in as to what has been done for the project in 1 year, in 1 month, in 6 months, and now you have this escrow of funds which pays out based on how much progress the project is making. So it's no longer like, oh yes, either it's been done with black and white or it has not been done, but now it's, okay, you've made the basic infrastructure, you've added this feature, you get paid out this much, or however much, and this is a way to avoid having people make money without doing anything, right? By having this checkpoint-based payout scheme. So ICOs are essentially a double-edged sword. They have this lack of regulation, which we desired from a cryptocurrency and from a system in general, but that lack of regulation makes it much more dangerous for the users, because now the users have to do their own due diligence. For example, OneCoin, if you've ever heard of that, it was a cryptocurrency. It was run entirely on a central database. It was just some number in some database which people were paying into. Like, I paid money for packages, as did everyone else, because they thought there was a blockchain. They just assumed there was a blockchain and put money into this OneCoin without even thinking about what was going on. Like, if they just done a little bit of research, they would have seen that there's no block. It's just a number. And they paid into it because it has the word coin in its name. And like, this also leads to centralization because now the people who really know this stuff get disproportionately rich and powerful because they're able to buy in strategically well and sell strategically well, and now they are amassing a lot of the money by just doing this repeatedly, right? Pump and dump. You get a lot of speculators to hop on, raise the prices of the currency, and then you sell it very fast, which brings the currency back, or brings the token back to its original value of close to nothing. Okay, so there's an issue about whether or not you really want to appreciate this lack of regulation. You have the benefits of traditional venture capitals, which is like you have to have everything laid out. You can't just be wishy-washy on what your product's going to do, or what your deadlines are. You have to say, these are our finances, these are our expectations, these are our products, what we aim to do, these are the checkpoints. And if something goes wrong, anything goes wrong, the venture capital can now sue because you had this legal agreement between these parties. Right? They can demand their money back, which you can't do in an ICO because once you've given someone your ether, it's gone. It's in their hands. They can do whatever they want with it at that point. So it's much more regulated, and you have to do a lot more development to make money through venture capital. And some of the drawbacks of ICOs is that there's no central party to carry out due diligence on your behalf. You're not going to have any one person like the SEC doing due diligence, at least for a good while. There's no central person who you can ask, And even very smart people, very technical people, may either not have the incentive to tell you whether something's broken because they might be making money off it, or they may also be wrong because there's a lot of moving parts when it comes to smart contracts and smart contract security, and you even have to trust the people who are making this product. So there's a lot of issues with just enforcing what you expect to happen. You're putting a lot of trust in the people who are making these things, which, as you know, is not in alignment of incentives. And so the due diligence is assumed to be done by the crowd itself. Who actually reads the white paper for an ICO? Who actually does the research before buying into it? People will just buy into it because they heard that Floyd Mayweather said that this ICO was going to be cool. Right, so this is led more by emotion and speculation than by sound business fundamentals. Because if it were by sound business fundamentals, you'd expect it to be happening through a VC. Right. The early adopters also tend to think alike. They all are of the same mentality. They don't really challenge their views. So this leads to like a sort of stagnation in the progress and development of whatever product it may be, and it leads to this immutable circumstance in which you can't get them out of the direction that they're moving. And because of that, how are you supposed to change things that you find issues with? And it can also be distracting when you have hundreds, if not thousands, of investors that you need to manage. And most of all, when there's so many scammy ICOs, it's impossible to tell which ones are legitimate, if any, anymore. Like, I've started getting Facebook ads that are saying, oh yeah, buy into this ICO, that ICO. It just goes in one ear, out the other. There's no point in paying attention to it, which is very sad. Like, there are some legitimate ICOs that are trying to make money, trying to develop a good project, but no one's going to listen to them because of the fact that they're associated now with all these scams. Or people will listen to them regardless of what they're actually doing and pay in because they see the words ICO, which is equally sad. And just some quick breakdowns of the venture statistics of blockchain startups categorized by product and or service. And some recent cryptocurrency statistics of the market capitalization. We see that it jumped very incredibly in July. One note about Ethereum that's interesting is that in order to participate in an ICO, you need Ether, so the value of Ether is going to go up when a huge ICO comes out, but as people anticipate more ICOs come out, people buy more Ether, which leads to like this huge evaluation of Ether solely as a means by which you can invest in something else, which is incredibly odd. Oh, she's already 6. Oh wow. Yeah, I suppose, yeah, I won't be able to get to the section, but I can talk about some stuff very quickly. It won't take too much of your time. There's anti-money laundering laws, there's know your customer laws, and there's money transmitter laws. Essentially, all of these different regulations by the US government to make sure that people aren't doing any sketchy stuff through some service. Like Coinbase, they don't want anyone laundering money through it, and Coinbase was sued because the IRS wanted information about all of their clients. So there's all these parts of compliance that anyone in the US has to comply with. There's a New York BIT license, meaning that if you want to interact with any person associated with New York or the New York State itself, you have to have this BIT license. Only 3 people currently have it. I believe Coinbase, Ripple, and Circle, and an exchange. So everyone else has had to back out of New York. They've had to ban New York IP addresses from participating in whatever it may be. You had Bitcoin, which was ruled too volatile to be considered an ETF back earlier this year because of so much control in the hands of China. It's unregulated. When China says no more ICOs, the price of Bitcoin drops 5%. That's a lot. That's a huge drop in valuation just because China says one thing. Because of that lack of regulation, the US doesn't trust it. There's some states that legitimize blockchains, like Arizona and Vermont. The information of blockchain is considered legal documentation. London, Switzerland, Japan are all pro-Bitcoin cryptocurrency and blockchains. And you have a long list of ones that don't agree with cryptocurrencies either. In Bangladesh, you could be in up to 12 years in prison if you are using cryptocurrencies. And in Russia, you're not allowed to use it either because it's competition for Russians' ruble. And yeah, that's it for the lecture. For your homework and readings, that'll be posted shortly tonight or tomorrow. I currently don't have them up. They should be liked. And yeah, you're free to ask if you have any questions. Thank you all for coming. And feel free to take more candy, of course.